You are not in control of your life. You only feel like you are. First, the decision happens, and then a voice appears and says, I did that. It may feel immediate, almost inseparable from the action itself, and even intimate. But if you look closely, there's a small gap, a delay. And inside that delay, something scientifically and philosophically unsettling begins to unravel. The assumption beneath every thought that you have is that you're the one deciding, choosing, and directing. That somewhere behind your experience, there is a central you that is operating the system. But this assumption isn't thoroughly examined. But for millennia, it was simply felt and accepted. If you slow the process even slightly, something shows itself. Thoughts don't seem to be chosen, they just arrive unconstructed and uninvited. It's always the same process. The cloud of random thoughts forms, then one thought sticks, and the chain of related thoughts begins. And after that happens, the sense of ownership attaches itself to it. And the important question here is not that you feel in control or not. The question is whether you can find the moment that control begins or not. Arman first noticed it during his midday nap. In his previous sleep thoughts, he saw a lot of random unrelated thoughts wandering in his mind's sky. Then suddenly one thought seemed to take center stage. It held his attention and a chain began to form around it. Associations connected, meaning started to build. And at that moment it felt like that he had chosen that thought, as if he had directed the mind toward it. It wasn't some dramatic enlightenment moment, but it was subtle and serious. After that incident, he would sit quietly and watch. A thought would appear, not invited or constructed, just appearing. Then a centralization followed, a decision, an action, a response. And only after that, a quiet voice would appear and say, I did this. But when he looked closely, the sequence was always the same. Not only he didn't start that chain of reactions, but he wasn't participating in that change while it was happening too. The unrelated thoughts came first, one thought sticks, and the ownership of that thought came after. Control, as he assumed it, seemed to be a narrative built on something more random that was already happening. The tension began to build. There was three very serious questions. Where did those random thoughts come from? Who was that who thinks he's the owner of the decision? And more importantly, who was the one who was observing all these processes without thinking or deciding or caring? If the control is real, it must exist before the action, not after it. But when he searched for that exact moment, it couldn't be found. There was no clear point where a decision was made in isolation, especially in the middle of random unrelated thoughts. Only a continuous unfolding of perception, impulse, and response, which was especially related to the mood of that day. The more obvious irony was that he could see the random thoughts, but the exact moment when the brain wanted to choose a thought to stick to was pure distraction. When he was aware, he would only see the random cloud of thoughts. But the moment he got distracted, the thought would become the first ring of the chain of self-whispering thoughts. This led him to a deeper question. If the sense of control is not directly observable, then what is it made of? It is made of memory and interpretation. After something happens, the mind reconstructs the sequence. It places a self at the center and organizes the events around it. This creates the feeling of continuity, of authorship, of control. But this construction is built after the fact. Control does not begin where you think it does. It begins as a reconstruction after the event is already unfolded. You feel in control because your mind rearranges the past in a way that places you at the center. But in direct, deep observation, there is no clear moment where a decision originates from a central self. First, the action processes appear, and only after that does the ownership follow. What you call control may simply be the mind telling a story slightly too late. Arman began to see that the self he identified with was not a fixed entity. It was a process, a pattern, a collection of memories, thoughts, and identifications that appeared consistent only because they were linked together over time based on the context of the day. But consistency is not the same as control. What he called I was only a narrative interface, a way of organizing experiences so that it feels coherent. Without it, there would still be experience, but without the same sense of ownership. This realization created an internal conflict. If there is no central controller, then who is making decisions? And who is the real you, the processes or the silent observer of those processes? At first, the question felt threatening, because it seemed to dissolve the myself completely with its responsibilities. But as he continued observing, something else became clear. Decisions were still happening, actions were still occurring, but they were arising from conditions, not from a central command. For example, when he was hungry, accidentally he remembered that they had some leftover pizza from last night's party. Thoughts lead to actions, actions lead to consequences, and those consequences influence the future thoughts. A continuous system of causations unfolding moment by moment. Does free will actually exist? There was no interruption in function, only a change of perspectives. Maybe we define concepts wrong, like control, self, or free will. The absence of a controller doesn't create chaos. It reveals that control was never required in the way that we humans imagine. Life continues to function through patterns, responses, and conditions. What changes is not the system itself, but your relationship to it. You stop seeing yourself as the one directing everything, and begin to see yourself as the one who observes it, or maybe the whole unfolding process. Arwan noticed something even more subtle. When he stopped trying to control every thought, every action, every outcome, his experience became more precise, not less responsible, more immediate. It was like the freedom unfolding itself. Instead of managing life, he began to observe it, and this created a beautiful space for him. And within that space, decisions still occurred, but they felt less forced, less constructed, more responsive to the moment itself, and sometimes he even stopped thinking, if we can even count that as a decision. This is where the illusion begins to dissolve. Control, as we usually understand it, depends on distance. The distance between you and what is happening, what is that you are controlling. And the moment that you try to grasp that distance, it disappears. Because in direct experience, there is no separation. There is only awareness and what is appearing within it. The idea of a controller arises after this fact. It is a conceptual overlay, a useful one perhaps, but not something that can be found as a direct experience. It was we and our culture creating only a concept. Arman didn't lose functionality, he lost illusion and found relief in the new freedom. And that changed the texture of everything. Responsibility no longer felt like pressure, it felt like participation. Choice no longer was control, it was a response. And more importantly, the urgency of being in control all the time dissolved with its pressure on him at once. Life no longer felt like something that he was managing from outside, or something to achieve with hard work. It felt like something he was inside of, continuously unfolding, a process to participate in. You don't lose control when you see through it. You lose the illusion that you were ever outside the process. Control depends on distance, but direct experience shows that there is no distance to begin with. What you call you is not the operator of life, but a moment within it, responding as it unfolds, or maybe the observer of it all. And in that realization, something quiet becomes possible, not control, but clarity. The philosophical implication of this is subtle but profound. Most systems of thought assume a central self that owns actions and decisions. But when examined through direct observation, that central self cannot be located. And more importantly, we seem to be too little to control everything. This doesn't invalidate experience, it strengthens it. Instead of asking, what am I controlling? The question becomes, what is happening right now before the story is unfolding? In that question, something shifts. Attention moves from narrative to perception, from explanation to observation, from control to awareness. And in that space, something begins to simplify. Not because life becomes easier, but because the need to define and control it becomes less dominant. You are still acting, still choosing, still moving, but the weight of ownership begins to dissolve. Not into nothing, but into something more immediate, more direct, more present. And perhaps that is the quiet edge of this inquiry. Not to eliminate the self, but to see clearly what it actually is. A process, a pattern, a moment of awareness appearing within something larger than itself. The self even doesn't look like one, but some. The observer, the process, the unfolding experience at once. And in that seeing, the question of control may no longer need an answer. Because the need to control was never as solid as it seemed. Only the belief in it was, like a chain on our knees. And that belief, when seen clearly, begins to soften, leaving behind something quieter, something simpler, something that was always here before the story began.